The armistice on the Western Front was signed on 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. They loved so much that magic date that another year of war would have been acceptable. The armistice was signed in a train carriage in Compiègne, and when Germany defeated France on 22 June 1940, Adolf Hitler insisted that the armistice was signed in exactly the same carriage. Over the course of the war, 700,000 women took up posts in the munition industry. With many men going to the front, there was a labor shortage, many women filling vacant positions. In 1917, anti-German sentiment forced George V to change the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor. Many road names in Britain were changed as well. More people died of the Spanish flu in a single year than in 4 years of the bubonic plague from 1347 to 1351, and during World War II, the Spanish flu caused about a third of total military deaths. Even though the US government didn't grant Native American citizenship until 1924, nearly 13,000 of them served in World War I, and they were of great use. The Germans were skilled at intercepting and solving Allied codes. They also captured 1 out of 4 paper messengers. However, when a US commander used Choctaw tribe members from the Oklahoma National Guard unit, they used an extremely complex language that the Germans could not translate. The 8 Choctaw men and others who joined them become known as the Choctaw Code Talkers. Poppies have become a powerful symbol of remembering fallen soldiers because it's one of the few flowers that grew on decimated battlefields. World War I is the 6th deadliest conflict in world history. The total cost of the war for the US was more than $30 billion. The war left thousands of soldiers disfigured and disabled. Reconstructive surgery was used to repair facial damage, but masks were also used to cover the most horrific disfigurement. Some soldiers stayed in nursing homes their entire lives. 4 empires collapsed at the end of the war: the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian. The collapse of the first, the Ottoman Empire, led to Britain and France taking their colonies in the Middle East as League of Nations mandates. Britain took control of Palestine and Mesopotamia, Iraq, and France took control of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, among others. World War I was the catalyst that transformed Russia into the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. It was the creation of the world's first communist state and ushered in a new phase in world history. Historians note that this was the most startling and important consequence of World War I. The long-term effects of World War I include the formation of the League of Nations, which laid the groundwork for the United Nations and the worldwide arms race. Additionally, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe sanctions on Germany, which drove the country into a deep recession, setting the groundwork for World War II. The First War helped strengthen the power of central government in the United States and Europe, which meant that 19th century liberalism that emphasized individual responsibility was gone forever. In fact, one of the chief legacies of the war is the lasting power of the state over its citizens. World War I also increased people's suspicions of minority groups. All outsiders were considered a potential threat, especially the Jews, who were seen as sleek profiteers of the armaments industry. Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland emerged as independent nations after the war. Also, Britain's leadership in the world economy was gone forever. It had huge debts, high unemployment, and slow growth. France suffered as well. Most of the loans it had made to Tsarist Russia were, of course, never paid by the new government. Inflation was rampant and large parts of the country were ruined. Russia underwent 2 revolutions. In October 1917, Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party took control. The first revolution in March had led to the creation of the provisional government, but their failure to stop the war brought massive support for the Bolsheviks. Still, World War I helped in some areas. It hastened medical advances. Physicians learned better wound management and the setting of bones. Harold Gillis, an English doctor, pioneered skin graft surgery. The huge scale of those who needed medical care in World War I helped teach physicians and nurses the advantages of specialization and professional management. The war helped bring about the emancipation of African Americans. For example, Henry Ford recruited black people from the South to work in his factories. The migration of African Americans from the South to the North during World War I was one of the most significant population shifts in the 20th century. The war also helped bring about the emancipation of women. They took over many traditionally male jobs and showed that they could perform them just as well as men. In 1918, most women over the age of 30 were given the vote in the British parliamentary elections. 2 years later, the 19th Amendment granted American women the vote. Nearly 2/3 of military deaths in World War I were in battle. In previous conflicts, most deaths were due to disease. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept guilt for the war and pay $31.4 billion in reparations. That's approximately 500 billion in today's money. Germany's army was capped at 100,000 soldiers and its navy at 6 battleships with no air force allowed. Germany's peacetime strength was 761,000 men prior to the war, so this was a significant reduction. Also, Germany lost 30% of its European territory, more than 27,000 square miles, 50,000 kilometers. Many nationalists in Germany called the signatories of the treaty the November criminals and refused to accept they had lost the war. This led to the stab in the back myth. Some nationalists blamed those responsible for signing the Treaty of Versailles, the new Weimar government, and Jews for the defeat of Germany. Germans were not the only people opposing the Treaty of Versailles. French General Ferdinand Foch said this of the Treaty of Versailles: "This is not peace, it's an armistice for 20 years. And he was right. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, he completely disregarded the treaty and used it as an excuse to fulfill expansionist policies. The failure of the signees of the Treaty of Versailles and of the League of Nations to stop him led to World War II 20 years later, after the signing. During World War I, the Turks slaughtered approximately 1.5 million Armenians. This act of genocide would later attract the attention of Hitler and was partly responsible for sowing the seeds of the Holocaust. The United States joined World War I during the final year and a half of fighting. Still, some Americans disagreed with the United States' initial refusal to enter World War I, so they joined the French Foreign Legion or the British or Canadian Army. A group of US pilots formed the Lafayette Escadrille, which was part of the French Air Force and became one of the top fighting units of the Western Front. The war transformed the United States into the largest military power in the world. During the war, the US has shipped about 7.5 million tons of supplies to France to support the Allied effort. That included 70,000 horses or mules, 50,000 trucks, 27,000 freight cars, and 1,800 locomotives. More than 200,000 African Americans served in World War I, but only about 11% of them were in combat forces. The rest were put in labor units, loading cargo, building roads, and digging ditches. They served in segregated divisions, the 92nd and 93rd, and trained separately. During US involvement in the war, more than 75,000 people gave about 7.5 million hour-minutes pro-war speeches in movie theaters and elsewhere to about 315 million people. To increase the size of the US Army during World War I, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which was also known as the conscription or draft, in May 1917. By the end of the war, 2.7 million were drafted, another 1.3 million volunteered. Despite those great numbers, the United States only spent 7.5 months in actual combat, during which time 117 people were killed and 204,000 were wounded. In the Battle of Verdun of 1916, there were over 1 million casualties in just 10 months. By 1918, German citizens were striking and demonstrating against the war. The British Navy blocked German ports, which meant that thousands of Germans were starving and the economy was collapsing. Then the German Navy suffered a major mutiny. After German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November the 9th, 1918, the leaders of both sides met at Compiègne, France, and the peace armistice was signed later on November the 11th. The end of the war and armistice. Although both sides launched renewed offensives in 1918 in an all-or-nothing effort to win the war, both efforts failed. The fighting between exhausted, demoralized troops continued to plod along. In August-September, an Allied offensive along the Meuse River and throughout the Argonne Forest succeeded in driving an exhausted German army backward toward the German border. A deadly outbreak of influenza, meanwhile, took heavy tolls on soldiers of both sides. Eventually, the government of both Germany and Austria-Hungary began to lose control as both countries experienced multiple mutinies from within their military structures. When they signed the armistice on 11th of November 1918, they agreed to surrender their arms, give up much of their navy, and evacuate occupied territory. The treaty stated that Germany had started World War I, it gave Alsace and Lorraine back to France, Poland picked up German territory in the east, and other territories were given to Belgium and Lithuania. The treaty also transferred the Hulshin area of Upper Silesia to Czechoslovakia. The eastern part of Upper Silesia was assigned to Poland. Lower Silesia, meanwhile, was left entirely to Germany. The key Baltic port of Danz, the industrial region of the Saar Basin, and the strategically important Rhine were also taken from Germany. Its armed forces were strictly limited and its colonies were made League of Nations mandates. The 1921 Reparation Committee decided that Germany should pay 33 billion in compensation to the Allies for the damage it caused. The treaty left Germany humiliated and impoverished, which left the world vulnerable to another world war. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended World War I just in 1919. Germany had to surrender its African colonies, and the League of Nations was started to prevent future wars. It helped Europe rebuild, and 53 nations joined by 1923. But the US Senate refused to let the United States join the League of Nations, and as a result, President Wilson, who had established the League, suffered a nervous collapse and spent the rest of his term as an invalid. Even Germany joined the League of Nations. It did that in 1926, but many Germans were very resentful of the Treaty of Versailles. Finally, Germany and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. Italy withdrew 3 years later, and the League of Nations was unable to stop the German, Italian, and Japanese from expanding their power and taking over smaller countries. Many believe World War I never really ended, and that World War II never would have happened if not for World War I. During the First War, journalists risked their lives to report on the war. The government tried to control the flow of information from the front line during the war, and journalists were banned from reporting. The War Office considered reporting on the war as helping the enemy, and if journalists were caught, they faced the death penalty. A handful of journalists did risk their lives to report on the war and the harsh realities that the soldiers faced. Around 12 million letters were delivered to the front line every week. Even during times of war, it took only 2 days for a letter to be delivered from Britain to France. By the time the war ended, over 2 billion letters and 140 million parcels had been delivered to the trenches. Plastic surgery was invented because of World War I. One of the earliest examples of plastic surgery came during World War I, when a surgeon by the name of Harold Gillis helped shrapnel victims with terrible facial injuries. Shrapnel caused many facial injuries in the war, and the twisted metal would inflict far worse injuries than the straight line wounds of a bullet. Dr. Gillis pioneered the early techniques for facial reconstruction. Over 250,000 underage soldiers were allowed to fight in the war. The youngest, a boy Sidney Lewis, was just 12 years old, but lied about his age to join. There were many thousands of underage boys who enlisted, and most lied about their age. Some joined for the love of their country, while others did it to escape from the lives and the poor conditions they lived in. Blood banks were also developed during the war. The routine use of blood transfusion was used to treat wounded soldiers. Blood was transferred directly from one person to another. In 1917, a US Army doctor by the name of Captain Oswald Johnson established the first blood bank on the Western Front. He used sodium citrate to prevent the blood from coagulating and becoming unusable. The blood was kept on ice for as long as 28 days and was transported when needed to casualty clearing stations for use in life-saving surgery on soldiers who had lost a lot of blood. And finally, army generals had to be banned from going over the top. One common stereotype is that ordinary soldiers were used by the higher-ups, lions led by donkeys as the saying goes, the donkeys being the incompetent generals who didn't spend any time on the front line, while thousands of soldiers, the lions, were killed. Actually, so many British generals wanted to fight and they had to be banned from going over the top because they were being killed, and the experience of a general was too important to lose. And that's, in closing, the aftermath of World War I. The creation of USSR and Treaty of Versailles that led to the Second World War might be the most important consequences that we feel to this day. That's all for today. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. I'd like to thank the last 2 persons that subscribed to the channel. And until next time, I'm Alex, and beware of falling apples.